Welcome, everyone. Welcome to a cast-free webinar. We have a really exciting opportunity tonight to speak with authors from Innovate Inside the Box. I always want to say outside the box, and I say, no, this is what's so cool about it, is we're inside the box. We're empowering learners through UDL and the Innovators Mindset. So there's a lot to those words, UDL and Innovators Mindset, that's going to hopefully be revealed to us tonight. And we're going to focus on accessibility, engagement, and innovation. So what better inspiration could there be, whether you're with us on East Coast time, which is 7 o'clock p.m., or first thing in the morning in Australia, or anywhere in between. I do want to thank our captioner, Lenore, for being there. And I want to invite you all to contribute to the conversation at any point in time. So you can use the text chat, where you open the chat panel from the center of the top of your Zoom window. There's a little spot that says chat. Make sure that you choose all panelists and attendees so we can all hear your comments and your questions. We may not take them all in the order in which they come, but we see them. We're going to respond to you, don't worry. And if there is something that you think is controversial, or you do want to just go to the panelist, you're welcome, of course, to just select to the panelist. You can also share through Twitter. So if you want to hashtag CastPL or at @cast_UDL, and we're going to give you some more Twitter feeds that you can add to the conversation right now, or if you're watching the recording. Thank you for those of us who are not joining live, but if you're watching the recording, you can continue to participate through Twitter. There's also a digital handout. So any of the key information from the slides, you'll be able to access through this digital handout. So you can go to that, that digital handout is a bit.ly/31IEB capital UP. So please feel free to access that digital handout and reference that at any point. So hopefully you have a few options to collaborate with us tonight. I did want to begin and share a quote from CAST founder David Rose. He said this after reading this manuscript, because this describes UDL as being a framework for all students, including students who have identified disabilities and who have been traditionally underserved. That no one articulates a more compelling, a more urgent, or more motivating vision of education, both for teachers and their students. And we're not leaving the students out of this conversation, than George Couros. No one articulates how that vision can be reached for every single student and every single teacher more daringly and practically and inclusively than Katie Novak. So having them together in one book not only helps us reimagine the goals and practices of education, but it reminds us of why we ever wanted to be teachers at all. That's huge. I think that's huge. So without any further delay, I'm going to stop talking so much, and I want to introduce Katie Novak and George Couros, the authors of this exciting book. Welcome you both, and as an introduction, I thought I would open it up for you to introduce something fabulous you would like to share about yourself, something that's behind the scenes that you can't just read in one of your typical bios.
You go ahead, Katie.
Okay, so first of all, I just want to talk kind of about how we got together to do this book, which is, I think, is a pretty cool story. Is one of the struggles that we all have in the field of UDL when we're talking about like the scholarly research. It's because the framework basically found its home in the disability community. So many people think that it's only in a special education framework. So as I kind of go around and I'll go to schools, everyone's like, oh, but we are general education, so we don't need to know about UDL, as if it's just some sort of specialized instruction. And, I think that trying to scale this with all learners has been really challenging. And so one of the things that I think was really cool is I saw George speak a couple years ago, and he was talking about something he calls the Innovators Mindset. And everything that he was saying, I was like, oh my gosh, this is expert learning. Like, this is what we're talking about. But it provided such a way to scale that information. So, I think that we were just kind of as a field, like, we're like, no, of course, all learners need to become expert learners. But expert learning was just something that was grounded in the field of UDL. And when I started thinking about like, no, we want kids to be problem solvers. We want them to be empowered. We want them to be innovators. Everything that he was talking about, I was like, we are literally saying the same thing, but he's talking to like such a bigger audience where everyone's like, of course, all kids need to learn how to innovate. And so I think that the fact that we were able to write this together shows that like, yes, expert learning is important, but this is not only for students who are traditionally underserved, which of course it is this is really about every single learner deserves the opportunity to have a personalized pathway to success. And so we met at a conference, and I spoke, and he spoke right after me, and we connected. And I was like, so we're writing a book together. And like, anyone who knows me on this webinar is like, oh, it's typical Katie. And I'm like, no, I will continue to write to you until we do this. Cause I think it's just such kismet to talk about the framework is not only about making things accessible, which is where we were living for so long, is it's also about empowering students to be innovators, which is something that everybody knows our kids need to be prepared for.
And like a second Katie, and yeah, she was pretty persistent with this idea, and I actually felt that I wasn't ready to write anything. But one of the things that really resonated when I met Katie is that she, I think a lot of times when we talk about the idea of universal design for learning, and actually, how we actually create opportunities for every single kid to be successful, and I think it's really important to say in ways that are meaningful to them, because a lot of times when we talk about success, we're talking about how the adults identify success for kids. One of the things that I really appreciated is that I don't think Katie ever says this work is easy, but she makes it really accessible. And I think that's what's really important. And when I say accessible, it's like, it's no matter where you're at, no matter kind of like what you're doing, what situation you're in, there's ways we can actually do this, and it just makes it just really enjoyable. And so it's just been awesome to actually work with Katie on this book. We've kind of, I'm sure you'll notice, we kind of like fight like brother and sister. I'm obviously the older, wiser brother, but yeah, it's been really great for the process. And I actually, it's funny because like really a lot of the stuff that I was doing tied into UDL, and I actually didn't really realize it. And through this process, I think both Katie and I really try to model this notion of being learners. And we're really learning about each other's work and how they intertwine and how they actually lift each other up, through this process, to help kids. And so, I would not say I'm an expert on anything, to be honest with you. I'm just a really voracious learner. And I'm constantly trying to like figure out ways to help teachers, help kids, and and how we do this. So it's really been it's an honor to actually be a part of this tonight and have people have access. So I'm really excited to talk with Katie.
Well, and what's nice and what makes a lot of sense about this, and what we often find in our work at CAST with UDL, is that you don't implement UDL to implement UDL. That doesn't
Right.
have meaning. But when
Right.
you think about implementing or using UDL as a tool to really help you get at, as you're describing, this expert learning and to help kids out and to make meaning, to innovate, to let students feel what that's like for themselves, that's the magic. And there's really something to that. So I think it's really exciting to think about this intersection a little bit. Katie, what do you think is, so I have a question for each of you before we dive into the book a little bit more. So, and again, all of these please feel free. And for those of you listening, we do want to go behind the scenes. So again, try to answer in ways that you can't find like on your blogs or on your website. Give us the, where did you arm wrestle for things, and where was it really tricky, or where did you, find moments that we might not know about. So feel free to go there. So Katie, what did you find to be the most unique part of your collaboration as you were thinking about bringing UDL and innovation together? What was really unique about this collaboration for you?
Well, what I thought was really the most challenging thing is that we write at such incredibly different times, so we could never actually collaborate.
That's excellent.
Like, you don't think about like writing a book with someone where I do all my writing like 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. and he does his when he's fresh. And so it was always like having to it was like a game of badminton, like, see what I wrote, but we were never working at the same time. And I would always be like, I don't know how you write so early. And he's like, I don't know how you write so late. And so I find that was really interesting because we talk about variability and we talk about collaboration. And in the book, we talk a lot about this importance as like being networked and what does it mean to be networked? And of course, in-person collaboration is amazing, but we're very different writers. And so, even though, I don't think that there was too much pushback within the content, it was just more like, sometimes would just be like, okay, let's talk about it. And I'd be like, that's too early for me. And he'd be like, that. And then we're on different time zones. And George on some days will be like, oh, I'm in Germany tomorrow. And it's like, oh my gosh, when can we talk? So it was a pretty cool example of a creation that really helped to personify the magic of all the digital tools we have, and again, we don't use technology to use technology, just like we don't use UDL to use UDL, but we were able to use technology to create something where we never ever would have been in the same room or on the phone at the same time, because we just we're rolling in these different universes. But, sometimes we'd be texting, and I'd be like, okay, what do you think of that? I just wrote a paragraph. What do you think? And he's like, I am literally sleeping. Like, leave me alone.
And what if you could only meet on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 1 to 1:40, and that was your only time to be able to collaborate?
There's no book.
So what we would have lost if we hadn't had all these flexible access points and an eye on the goal, a vision on the expert content that you wanted to communicate with everyone. So George, David Rose, one of the co-founders of CAST, used to say, teaching is emotional work. So this is similar to your work in innovation, where you note that at the core of all learning experiences, it begins with relationships. So could you share more about why relationships are so critical to foster this innovation and learning?
Yeah, and I think so. I think that a lot of times I was actually just working with a group of educators today, and we were talking about this notion of innovation. And a lot of times when we talk about innovation, it's like, oh, look at flexible spaces, look at all this technology, look at all this other stuff. But to me, innovation is really a human endeavor. And the way that I actually really explain this is that if you think about your own context and, where you work, right? And what you're willing to try and take risks and who you're trying to do this. So if I have a boss that I don't believe that we have a good relationship, I don't have trust in that space, I'm not going to take risks. I'm going to basically do the bare minimum. I'm going to just do, what's there. But if I know I can trust this person, that they'll not only really have my back, but they'll push me as well. And I think that's something we really touch upon on the book, that it's not about the relationships only so that it's all like fluffy and like, everything, every kid gets an award kind of thing. That's not what we're saying. We're saying we're building that relationship. So there's like a reciprocated trust, in the process, so that the students we serve actually feel comfortable pushing themselves, trying different things and actually getting uncomfortable. And so you think about when we talk about the idea of innovation, and we simply define it as doing new and better things, with the better thing being the essential part of that it's not really innovation if it's simply new but it's terrible. And so if I'm going to do better things, that how do I tap into the passions of the people that I'm serving? How do I connect with them? How do they know that when they try something new in pursuit of it being better, that they have their support? And so when Katie and I were talking about this, we really talked about, and Katie's right, like the collaboration through the process was really interesting, because basically we wrote the book in two different voices but connected. And Katie, I'll be honest with you, like Katie did such an amazing job basically reading my stuff and just intertwining UDL in such a way that it feels like it's one author, but we distinctly share, because we have different areas that we focus on in the book, but that relationship piece is everything. And so when we started talking about like what are the things that we have to really rethink, and what really is this core of the work that we're doing, and as you can see in that circle, you can see the idea of relationships in the middle. And what I'm outright saying in the book is that this is actually more important than all of the other things, that the other things actually will not be as effective if we don't really take time to build those relationships, build our rapport, know the people we serve, and connect with them. So I think that's what we're actually starting with. And I can go into the next part, but I know you'll probably have some other questions, Allison, if you just want me to keep going.
Well, I'm just wondering what your UDL background was before coming to this work.
My UDL background was Katie. That was my UDL background.
That's a pretty good place to start, I have to say.
Yeah, like basically, I like when I first met Katie, she was actually talking about UDL. And I just want to be clear that I stayed for her presentation, but she left to go.
I had 4 kids in a minivan,
and I'm surprised. I already know, like, you're like, when I thought you were going to ask me, like, what was the hardest part about working with Katie? And I'd be like, working with Katie. No, I'm just kidding. Katie is amazing. Katie is absolutely incredible person, as much as I make fun of her. But yeah, like I actually, I learned like a lot of stuff through, through Katie. And I actually had followed David Rose's work earlier. And I know, so I worked in Parkland School Division, and we touched on, some UDL aspects. And so, I will be honest that Katie was, like, I guess part of me too was a little insecure about it, because I don't know this as well, obviously, as Katie, but honestly, I don't think anyone knows it as well as Katie, which is, so she really helped bridge the connections to the work that I was doing in UDL. And I think that's really became powerful.
And the idea of the pass the baton that I love, I literally pictured you all, in full run, passing the baton. Yeah. Was that inspired from a race or?
No, we just wanted, like, I think, for when we were talking about doing this book, I'm maybe biased on this. I don't like when it just says I, George, in brackets, and I feel it just really takes away from the voice of the book. And so we wanted to, like, have it so it, like, obviously we have different talents and abilities, and that's why we brought the book together. But I wanted the parts that were my voice to be my voice, and to be distinct, and Katie's voice to be Katie's voice. And I just think it felt, I really proud of it, because it felt really conversational. Like, it's not like I'm talking about one thing and Katie talks about totally something different. Like, it's so built to connection, right? And like, it was, and like, as Katie is saying, I felt like when we were reading this book, and honestly, because Katie, like, I think Katie is the best, and she's just awesome, like, just the best person to work with. My wife loves her for some reason. So she just
her heels, she wants to get to use the good shoes.
Yeah, exactly. So the process of what we were doing was, I would basically write the beginning of each chapter in part 1, and then Katie would basically come in at night and then just look at what I wrote, and then she would just build on what I'm talking about and connect it. And so then I, like, get up in the morning, and then I'm, like, basically reading to understand what Katie is writing. And so it's like I'm getting this, like, weird professional learning process through just kind of, like, how Katie's expanding and actually, like, and this is part of it too, and Katie will tell you this about me. When I said, Katie, like, if you're reading stuff, don't edit it. Don't come in and say, you need to fix this and this, just fix it. Like, if I'm saying it wrong, and I think that's how much trust we had in one another, that we wouldn't, like, say, hey, you need to think about this. It's just like, I just go in and fix her stuff, and she fix my stuff, because we really know kind of what the vision of what we were trying to do. But, sometimes, obviously, through writing a book, it doesn't come across as clear. And if Katie doesn't understand what I'm saying, then she just fixed it. And it was just amazing.
You all were taking risks and getting uncomfortable, and maybe having to use some of the innovating inside of the box in this project. Could I dare say?
Absolutely. And I think like, the really cool thing is, like, Katie mentioned this, like, we have met face to face all of 10 minutes before we actually wrote a book together. Mm-hmm. And for me to say, hey, just, like, go fix my stuff, in a book that's going to be published, it's a big risk. But that actually, and it's not because I'm, like, naive. It's just because even through a digital medium, we really connected. And I trusted Katie, and I know her intentions to help kids, and she knows my intentions to help kids. Yeah. And so there's no ego involved with this, right? Because, like, I'm not upset if she fixes something, if it makes it better to help teachers help kids. That's
And
the
you
whole
just hit on
purpose.
such a key piece. When you have that common goal and you
Yeah,
care about it, then it's almost like the sky's the limit on what you can create. You figure out the way to do it. And that is really what we want to be able to hand over to our kids. So with
absolutely.
that, and yes, and thank you for that comment, Melanie, no ego, you keep the vision on the kids. I am going to turn the next section over to the two of you then, and I'm going
Sure.
to back out a little bit. Thank you for that introduction. It's awesome.
Yeah, so when we were talking about kind of the core, it reminded me of another one of my quirky habits that like when he called me on it, like everyone who I was close to was like dying laughing, but like, my attention span, it struggles a little bit to begin with. So you could be in the middle of a text chain with me for a solid 10 minutes and then say something really profound and I'm out for 20 hours. Like I get distracted and then forget about the text message. And you'd be like, oh my gosh, this is like an important question. You can't leave right there. But my husband's like, you literally do that literally all the time. We're in the middle of something and I'm like, but that's kind of the magic of variability and collaboration too, is, recognizing that again, any relationship has things that like people are going to drive you insane. And I think there's something really beautiful about that.
I'm just going to interrupt you for a second because I need to build on this. Katie literally will have a conversation with herself. She will lose her point in her conversation. So it's not like it's just her texting me back and forth, and then it's me. It's actually her talking about one thing, then going to another, and then forgetting what she was talking about. So it's not like
Yes.
she could do that by herself. That's the amazing thing.
Students with attention problems, there's a place for them in this world.
It's amazing. It is so amazing. You can just watch her talk and she'll have a conversation with herself and she'll get distracted by her own words. It's really amazing.
Wait, what was I talking about?
We need a little scaffold.
But that's the magic of the relationships, is like you have to when you every student, I've been reading all these studies lately, and it's like you ask adults, do you have a really strong relationship with every kid? And the adults are like 90% yes. And I'm making up these numbers and I'm being fresh. But then you ask kids, do you have a relationship with an adult? And there's like some serious inequity there in our beliefs that we have strong relationship with kids, and then kids' beliefs that they're truly embraced for their own identity and their own learning, variability. And I think that some of the point here is that we have to see kids for who they are and recognize that the system that we have built, this box that we have built, is doing exactly what it was designed to do. We can't say it's a broken system. It's a system that was meant for something else. And now that we're trying to get every kid, to recognize that yeah, we don't all need to do this in the same way because robots do it in the same way and we're not looking for recipes, but I see you, I value you as a learner, and I will therefore make a pathway for you. And I think that a part of this collaboration that worked really well is that there was a pathway for me always to, to be able to contribute in the way that I could contribute. And we had the best time, and I felt completely respected and for who I was. And do kids get that? It's I run on a weird schedule. I'm all over the place. But that doesn't mean that I can't be successful. And, so many kids with learning and attention issues don't get a chance to be successful because we don't give them the options and choices to kind of personalize their own journey. So at this core, the relationship has been really important for both of us, but then also trying to think about, today I was with my 6th and 7th grade teachers, and they were talking about piloting a curriculum, and we think we're going to try this. We're hoping it's going to be good. And I said, and if it's not good, who cares? Even if you totally bomb it, there's something really beautiful about that. And then you have a better story to tell and you know what not to do. But don't be scared of the failure on this. It's 2 weeks of a unit, go big. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. But that is where, do they trust that that's okay? So George is going to go through the next 3 slides and kind of explain what's the next tier around those relationships that really makes the Innovators Mindset and UDL work.
And because I interrupt, because my head goes in a million, I do.
George is used to it. Don't worry.
You just know, you commented on something. A teacher not too long ago, they were laughing in a session I was doing, and they turned to each other and they said, if our students were doing this, we would tell them to shush. And the power of laughter, the power of the laughter that you all brought to that, the power of what you were just saying, to be able to have those relationships build and have the perception of the resources to be available to you, that are available to you, come from that affective emotional place, that teaching is emotional work quote that we set up at the very beginning. So I thank you for your laughter and hopefully we can have that be contagious in the classrooms as well to help build those relationships. So yes, have at it, George. Thank you.
Well, it's just it's it's funny because like every time I talk to Katie, like it just, you know, we there's always things I learn and, you know, think about and actually tied to this work. And like Katie, I know Katie has to deal with kind of my weirdness and I have to deal with Katie stuff driving me crazy.
Very
And I was
good.
like, so I was actually thinking about this, right? Like a lot of people listening, to this podcast are teachers who had a student who drove them crazy. Like Katie could drive me crazy, but then they also just think they're the best person ever. And that those little differences about how we are, we have to celebrate them and really tap into, you know, what the people's strengths are, right? Because like I'll tell you, Katie and my wife could talk forever and they will talk and honestly, I don't really, I kind of say what I have to say and I don't really talk that much and I'm kind of quiet and I'll get a text from the morning. Katie's just like her million ideas. And that's like, it was just, it's nice because we are not the same, but we have both strengths. And I think this is something that's really important in the work that we actually do in education is the connection that we actually have to understand that people are different, but that doesn't mean they're not better, or I guess they don't have real gifts that they bring to the table. And like one of the things that I always say is that, you know my daughter is very intelligent. She's a very bright kid, but I have no clue if she's gonna be academically gifted. But I want to know that when she goes to school, people are gonna be looking at her for what she's talented at, what her strengths are, what her abilities are. And I'll know, I 100% guarantee you, she will drive people crazy, my daughter. But I still, that doesn't mean she's doing bad things. It just means like we're different. And, you know,
and we
so
can design for that. We can design for that.
Absolutely. And I just think it's really important like, it's just, yeah, I'll tell you, it's just fascinating. And like, I've had kids who, you know, remind me of those things and just, we have to tap into this. But anyways, I'll get into, I'll kind of talk about this and then I'm going to talk about the core and I'll let Katie dig in. And so what we talked about first, and I know we kind of touched upon this, is the notion of how important relationships are. And as kind of I addressed is really like, how do you know your kids, connecting with them? And part of it is really setting the environment. And like one of the things I talk about, and I don't know if Katie can maybe Google it because I have a blog post on it, is like 10 easy ways to like build a classroom culture. And it's like, you know, just like when kids, are you actually greeting kids at the door? And there's like actually there's like a ton of research that it's a simple thing as like greeting kids at the door every single morning actually totally changed the environment, has led to like higher academic success, which is not the only measure that we're looking at, but I know a lot of people obviously do care about that. But it's just the connection. And one of the things I always say about my own daughter is that the focus is, you know, she might not be the best academic student, but if she comes to school, things you can control is, does she feel valued? Does she feel welcome? Does she feel that you're looking for her gifts and bringing that up? And like little subtle things like, you know, when I walk into a classroom, is there music playing? Like, does it give me energy? Like when I walk into a room in the morning, does it give me energy or does it suck the life out of me? And I think that's something we always got to be thoughtful of our kids. And so the next part I talk about is the slide that Allison, you have up, is the idea of learner-driven, evidence-informed practice. And so this one is a really interesting, because I have I share this comment often, and I share it sometimes to kind of irk people and get them bothered because I'm trying to spark conversation. And one of the things they say a lot is data-driven is the stupidest term in education. And I know a lot of people get mad at me, but if you just hear me out, kind of why I say this, the people who talk about the importance of being data-driven, I honestly 100% believe they actually have the same intentions that I do. They really want to help kids. They really want to help focus. But when a lot of people, and this is conversations that I've actually had with so many teachers in my travels, when they hear the term data-driven, all they hear is, it's all about the scores. We don't care, like, as long as we get the scores, that's what matters. And so I really make the distinction that we're not saying don't use data. We're not saying like, don't look at any of those things. But really, when we talk about the idea of learner-driven, evidence-informed practice, do I actually know the students in front of me? Do I actually like know who they are and what like taps into them? And in and then use evidence to really like inform my practice. And so I actually share in that chapter, I share these like 5 questions that you should actually ask your students when you're actually like looking at how do you define them. So for one of them examples, like, what are the qualities you look for in a teacher? What are you passionate about? What is one big question you have this year? And that will really tie into the next one. And then what are your strengths and how can we utilize them? And and I kind of touched base on this earlier, what does success at the end of the year look like to you? And I think that when we are talking about those things, we're trying to get to know the kids so we can tap into them. And so like I was talking about this today. I have a kid in my class says something I'm really passionate about. I actually want to be a YouTuber. Like I want to make YouTube videos, but nowhere in the curriculum does it like do the step-by-step to get kids to become YouTubers, right? But I got to teach, and I think this is the whole premise of Innovate Inside the Box. I actually have to teach this science curriculum. And so there's certain content. So what I would say to a kid is like, hey, I got to teach these parts of the science curriculum. Why don't you actually make a YouTube video and actually build it and explain these concepts to the entire world? And I had this conversation today, and a lot of times, teachers are afraid, well, like, what if the kid doesn't want to make the YouTube video? What I would say to the kid is, well, it's going to be hard to become a YouTuber if you don't want to make that video. You should figure it out. And I think we have to be comfortable saying to our kids, and actually, like, I was having a conversation, and I'm always learning from Katie, and I was saying, and we were talking about, like, is it always about the teacher? Like, do the teacher has to remove every single barrier for the kid, like anything that's in their way? And she's like, no. Sometimes it's actually teaching the students how to remove those barriers for themselves. And that's a skill that you really have to develop. And that was like, that was such a turn, like that really clicked through me. And she actually said it after the book. She should have wrote that in the book, but that's a whole other conversation.
You'll do another book then.
Right. Well, yeah. Now I have to do it. Yeah. But that was eye-opening for me, right? Mm-hmm. And so the reason why I use that example is I know we know some of the constraints and barriers. We know some of the things that we don't like in education, but they are realities. I got to teach a curriculum, but I actually want these kids to have these opportunities. So how do I connect the two, as opposed to saying, here's curriculum over here, here's innovation, try to figure out what to do it, actually, opposed to connecting the two. And Katie and I are both adamant that, there's a lot of things that the box has to change, but we also, and another gem that Katie gave me, she said for the grade 3 kid this year, this is their 1 year in grade 3. And so if I keep waiting for other people to change stuff, that kid loses out on an incredible experience. And so I think Katie and I are both adamant that we're going to continue pushing to change what, the box looks like. But while we are stuck in those spaces, whatever they look like at this point, we're going to continue to transform. And that's why we want, really, because I think a lot of times when we are so focused on data, we lose sight of the kid. And that's why we talk about the learner-driven evidence-informed practice. And I'll actually, if we can go to the next slide, Allison. The next one is we talk about how do we create empowering learning experience. And this is actually another conversation that Katie and I were having, because we were talking about this notion of engagement and what engagement, is. And the easiest connection, because a lot of people will challenge you and say, well, you don't talk about engagement, you talk about empowerment. Like, isn't engagement important anymore? And excuse me, the easiest way I can explain this is that if you are engaged, it doesn't mean you're empowered, but if you're empowered, I guarantee you're engaged. But it takes it to this different level, because now we're actually giving kids more ownership over the process. We're actually giving them, more say, but now it's actually really tapping in and bringing out the best of the kids. And I think what we have to constantly revisit is, what is the purpose of school? And a lot of times, if we're being honest, a lot of times the way we do school, the purpose of school is to be successful at school. And for me, the purpose of school is to actually help kids to figure out how to be learners, to figure out whatever they need. And like I said earlier, to find a pathway to success that is meaningful to them. But if everything I do is about my teaching and about how engaging I am as a teacher, then what happens when the engaging person doesn't go on and the student doesn't know how to learn, right? And so I think that's really why I would talk about that. And I know, like, I want to make sure that I give Katie a lot of time. So I'm going to make sure I go to the next one. And so with all of these things, the next one is the master learner, master educator. And I talk about 3 different things that we have to focus on learning. It's learning for our students. And like, that's obvious. We've been doing that forever, you know, whether it's professional learning, whether it's like building our professional learning networks, etc. The next one is learning about our students. And obviously that's a theme you can see over and over again, is who are the kids in front of us? What are the strengths? How do we tap into them? How do we bring this? And then learning with our students. And one thing that I've been challenged about over and over again is like, you know, saying like, hey, I'm a learner with my students, is like, what happened? The teacher's not the expert anymore. Like, we're just like replacing the teacher, and we think the kids know as much as a teacher. And that's not it at all. We're still really identifying the teacher as the expert, but what's really important to understand, the classroom as a whole knows more than the teacher as an individual. And what we're trying to do is actually bring out the wisdom and experiences in kids so we can actually learn from them too. And like, I'll give you like a really subtle example. I used to teach, my first year teaching, I taught technology. And honestly, I did not know anything, but they just saw this guy who had a little bit of tech experience, and they just threw him in a position nobody knew. And so I would actually sit in a classroom with these students, and I wouldn't know how to do things. And I would just say, hey, does anyone know how to do this? And the kids would just like do all these things to like figure out, you know, how to do this. And they would go, oh, Mr. Couros, I figured it out. I'm like, oh, that's so cool. I had no clue. And as soon as they figured out that I didn't know some things, they were like, oh, Mr. Couros shouldn't be teaching. They went out of their way to actually like go find things that I didn't know, because they felt, as Katie talks about, they were experts, that they were actually sharing. And now they felt they had a purpose in the classroom. They felt they had a contribution. And I will say to you, I would like to say that year, like, I felt I knew more than them, like with the stuff, but I didn't know everything. And I learned so much from the students because I was open to that process. And again, that does not mean the teacher is not the content expert. It doesn't mean the teacher isn't the most knowledgeable person in this room. It's just that we have more knowledge together. You know, it's like saying like, well, only, you know, in a school, only the principal can teach the teachers. Like, that would, anyone, do you think that would be ridiculous? You know, even though the principal might have 50 years experience, I don't know. But it's really the idea.
Reflection on our our perceived power structure in the classroom.
Yeah, and I would say this to my teachers when I was principal all the time. It is not about your idea. It is not about my idea. It is about the best idea. We don't care where it comes from, and so we need to create those structures. And so just to make sure, you know, just to kind of go over this, and I know Katie's going to take over. Those 4 areas that I talk about are really what we talk about as the core. As here is the things that are really essential to kind of set up in place to kind of be effective in, you know, how we're actually developing our kids, you know, in these different, like the notion of resiliency, how do we actually work with empathy, and, you know, how we, you know, connect UDL to all these dots. So it's really talking about the practice of the work that we actually do to really kind of think different, because like, if we want to do different things, we can't do that with the same thinking. And so it's really kind of trying to jolt and have some conversations. And just the last thing, we give ideas about each area, and we actually talk about this. But I think what's different is we say, we're just giving you ideas, but you have to take these things and you have to make them relevant to your community. Like, I can't write a book about someone in a school across the world and say, hey, I've never been to your school, but these 3 things, if you do these will work.
Well, and George, that brings us to an important question that that came in from the chat. And that's, for example, if a teacher just starts to greet students at the door, that's not to say that just doing that one thing is going to make a difference. So, a lot of research can demonstrate that teachers who greet students at the door do have that does have a positive impact on students' learning. It's hard to know if that's correlation or causation. So the students who, the teacher who's greeting,
right,
is also likely implementing a lot of other innovative strategies and UDL strategies, so their students learn more and can be empowered. So it's an interesting balance, I'm sure, as you're saying. You can't say, if you do 1, 2, and 3, X, Y, and Z are going to happen, but it's really about building that complex ecosystem and getting back to your initial point of the importance of building those relationships and getting to know your students.
And I think that's like one of the really complex things about education, right? That, a lot of schools are like, hey, we did this thing and it led to these extra scores. I'm like, no, you actually did 80 different things and you put a focus on this, and this was one of them, right? I guess for me, and I understand, like, does the research support it? I'll tell you this from a personal standpoint: when I actually feel welcome and appreciated environment, I'll do way more. And if I don't feel welcome and appreciated environment, I will do the bare minimum. And some kids, they will not do the bare minimum; they will leave. And that to me is really something. And like I think that's why I keep coming back to this notion of relationships. And one of the concepts I talk about is the idea of school teacher versus classroom teacher. And one of the students I just had an interaction with this past year, she actually talked about how she had suffered from depression. She had, dealt with suicidal thoughts, and she was having a really hard time. And one of the things that she actually talked about, and it was just the most powerful thing, she said one of the things that got her up every single morning was a teacher in the hallway who never taught her a class ever, who said hi to her and greeted her by her name every single morning. And like, that's the thing, is that I'm always like, yeah, okay, so like, let's say me doing that every single day doesn't lead to better test scores, but it actually helps a kid. I know this is going to sound sacrilegious talking about education. My number one concern is that kid, comes to school every day, and I do everything to help them be happy in the environment. That, whether it leads
that shows it just takes one positive relationship to make
Yeah.
that difference. So you just need one, but that can be really hard to find.
Mm-hmm.
School teacher versus classroom teacher. Excellent. Thank you. As we shift to thinking about and how this connects with expert learning and how this connects with UDL, I'm interested.
I'm gonna mute my mic because Katie says I'm a heavy breather.
You're all gonna hear George
I'm
breathing.
gonna mute my mic.
But we want to continue.
I don't want to
there
get
are
any
arm
heavy.
wrestling conversations.
So I'm gonna
Every exhale, there is brilliance that comes forth.
He's thinking deeply. It's a variability in nostril form.
We did a podcast together, and I kept missing my cues. And he's like, everyone's like, why? And I'm like, I'm just really nervous that people are going to hear me breathing, and so I always mute myself. And so now it's like I'm a heavy breather, but like in through the nose, out through the nose, and I'm doing better. But
if we get to thinking about the relationship between this innovator's mindset and expert learning, which is the goal of UDL, how do you see those two connecting? I mean, I'm in my head forming explosions going off, but in a couple minutes, are there a couple highlights that you want to focus in on here?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that we George actually wrote it in his section in the book, but he said, like, if our kids leave school and they have all this knowledge and they hate learning, then we have like clearly screwed up the past 13 years. This is all about, we are trying to provide this foundation so kids know how to learn. So when they leave us at like a very young age of 18 or 19, that they know how to learn. They can set good goals for themselves. They understand how to find those resources and collaborate. And so in UDL, we always say, they're purposeful, they're motivated, so on and so forth. But the reality is if you think about the innovator's mindset, if you could give a click, I don't know if it will show up here. I don't know if my animation is going to work or if it's going to be fresh. There we go. Perfect. So when you're thinking about the characteristics of an innovator's mindset, and this is in George's first book, which is titled aptly The Innovator's Mindset, they talk about these. And again, this is when I, he heard me speak, and then I started looking at all of his work, and I was like, we kind of exchanged books after the keynotes that we did together. And I'm looking at these and I was like, oh my word, these like sparkles are coming down. And so when we say that we want kids to be truly engaged, we want them to be purposeful, we want them to be motivated, we talk about the 3 UDL guidelines being like, obviously you have to get them interested, but then it goes much deeper into the commitment part, which is like, how do you get them to sustain effort and persistence? And how do you get them to self-regulate? And when you look at the checkpoints, they remind us of the importance of being able to cope, being able to set goals, and then this purpose of like fostering collaboration and community and really minimizing the threat of taking these risks, right? So what we're trying to do through engagement is getting kids to become resilient, to actually set goals, to try something challenging, and then recognize that, hey, guess what? Like, success is a bunch of little micro failures that make up the success in the end. So please do not be afraid of these micro failures, because like when you build them all up, that's where you get where you want to go. They're stepping stones. And so what we're talking about when we're saying to like really sustain effort and persistence, what we mean is we want kids to take risks, and we also want them to be able to recover from those risks. And to do that, we have to use all of these other strategies. Somebody had mentioned something about his wife was a rec therapist. That's actually my first life. I am a recreational therapist. That was my background before I went in to get a master's degree in education. And this concept of recognizing that even, sometimes when your circumstances seem like, gosh, I'll never be able to partake in these really great art and music experiences again, like there's always a chance, there's always a way. So how do you find that way? But to do that, again, you have to build relationships with other people, because other people become resources for you. They can provide you with feedback. And so when we're talking about fostering collaboration and community and like minimizing the threats, what we're talking about is being an innovator. If you want to go out and make this world your own, okay, you have to be all these things. But you can't be all these things without also building some sort of knowledge. And, school was really great at knowledge, but kids never really had to be resourceful because we were resourceful for them. Like, if a teacher preps everything, it's like, here are the resources that you need to answer this question. A much better question is, what resources do you need to answer this question? How do you determine if they are reliable? How do you determine if they are authentic? And now create something where you answer the question with those resources. So what we want our kiddos to do is to be really observant, notice all the resources around them. There is not one pathway to get where you want to go. For the love of all that's good, I was like a very subpar student. I was waitlisted to state college. Like, if I honestly thought there was only one pathway to be successful, and that was through being a really good student, I would have dead-ended. But you have to recognize that there's always another way if you're resilient, if you're willing to take the risk. And then also the reality is we can't just always wait and react. It's all about being proactive. And that's why I love about UDL is it's really almost framework and curriculum and location agnostic, in that, in anything in life, when you think about your goals, what can you predict will prevent you from achieving those goals? So somebody had asked a question about like, but what about kids with really severe behavioral and social emotional issues? Well, I know, for example, that one really significant barrier to learning when you're thinking about social emotional learning is trauma. And I also know that there are really great trauma-informed practices. So being proactive about implementing trauma-informed practices while providing kids with options and choices to work together, to choose how they're gonna share what they know, to choose if they're gonna work with someone or not, that does reduce barriers, absolutely, and creates more learning. And then this other thing is we're always asking questions for kids. Like, we need them to start asking questions for themselves. Deeper learning is all about them actually saying like, here's a problem and I'm going to find a way to fix it, as opposed to us saying, here's a problem and here's everything you need to fix it. Because what's really good at doing that? Robots. And then the last, when we talk about strategic and goal directed, a lot of people just think of that as being like assessment. And it's like, well, they have a graphic organizer or not a graphic organizer, so it's universally designed. And it's like, no. When you share the goal, like, this is the standard, okay? And you say to kids, I need you to show me that you met the standard. What can you create? What strategy do you need to follow so that you can show me that you've met this? But then it's this cyclical, constant cycle of saying, always be reflecting on, if you haven't met it yet, how do you need to be more resourceful? How do you need to try to figure out what the problem is for you? How do you identify your barrier and eliminate that? And I can absolutely be there to show you some ideas, and to give you feedback. But like, I am not designing for the 25 kids who sit in front of me. I am designing for any one of the million kids you can put in front of me. And I know that there's no way I could choose a book that's culturally responsive for every kid. But I can empower a kid to choose a book that's culturally responsive for themselves if I give them all the places they can find those books, read the reviews, find out the reading level, access it on audio. And so this is about truly creating a foundation, not only so every kid can access and engage with curriculum, but that they can learn how to learn and become innovators. And so like for me, this was the big aha moment of like, this is what we need to show this is not only for kids with disabilities. This is not only for underserved learners, which of course we need to serve all learners, but every single kid moving into this unknown future has to know how to navigate change.
I just feel like I want to cheer. I was cheering right there with you. And I do think you have a title for your next book, Successes, Micro Failures, which is really exciting and really interesting to think about how young, I know there was a comment also about how young students can be when they start to build those skills and those habits of mind. It's not like, oh, that's going to happen in 5th grade when they are ready to go to middle school. They can start it at a really young age. They can start it in any context, in any learning environment. These are skills that they can start to build and own for themselves. And UDL gives a really nice language for how to help find those barriers and think about that variability, which can be really empowering. And I lost my second thought. So I'm going to shift to the next slide where we can think about, so I'm interested to think about some of the specific examples where teachers can really empower the students that you're describing so that they really are, they're the ones driving their learning, not us. They're not sitting there passively showing up, just not being engaged, but they are being designed for from the beginning to be engaged.
Yeah, so the way that this visual works is kind of from the inside out, which is we talked about like, first we have to believe in all kids. That's what it comes down to. We see kids for their unique identity. We see them for their unique mix of strengths and weaknesses. We believe in our colleagues. We believe in our leaders. We believe in our parents and our families. We have to start by like just going to the humanness of learning. And then what we have to do is, again, we have to zoom out and we have to recognize that like we as cogs in the system have to always be learning ourselves. We have to make sure that we are literally talking about children and not just about numbers. And that of course we want to make sure that these environments truly are ones that every student can be successful. And if we do that, we zoom out to these characteristics of an innovator's mindset. But what you'll see on the outside is we put, that's where the UDL principles come in, is when we provide multiple means of engagement and representation and action and expression, we are able to build the innovator's mindset in students and in adults so that everyone can really kind of create these empowered learning experiences. And that is fueled by our belief in each other and our belief that this system can be changed. Because what we know now is it doesn't work for all students. It doesn't work for most students. And when we truly value every kid as a unique learner and we see them for who they are, we are then much more apt to step back and get out of their way and say, I will design a learning experience that empowers you to make your own choices. And that can be done in pre-K, and that can be done in kindergarten, and that can be done with, your students all the way through until they graduate. But what we talk about in the book is the second part of the book is we talk about each of these innovators' mindsets, characteristics, and then we give specific strategies in UDL where we'll say, okay, these are the barriers for building empathy. One barrier to build empathy is that students don't have a really strong understanding of feelings, like what are the core emotions and why they're very natural to feel that way. And for every kid that's falling, walking around just ready to rebel, picture myself late for a meeting in traffic. And I know that feeling in the pit of my stomach. And I've spent 40 years trying to cope with that feeling. And sometimes I fail miserably. But, recognizing that like there are barriers that prevent kids from being able to be really empathetic. And so let's try to identify what those barriers are and then proactively address those. So we go through, and the second half of every chapter in part 2 is what are the options and choices that we need to be kind of a foundation of our own classroom so that we give students the skills so that they can be reflective and empathetic and creative. What tools do they need? What options do they need? And if we do that well, it's always fueled by the fact that I recognize that my way is not the only way and that I'm honoring you as a learner.
Awesome. Awesome.
George, you want to add into that? See, he's muted because you don't hear his breathing. So just really quickly, we talk about future ready all the time, and there's no good framework that, like, we say 21st century skills and future ready and 21st century. And you know, we talk about that all the time. I just want to like replace it with like, with the 21st century is like, we're like in it. We're in it to win it right now. Like, we got to move on. The reality is we always need people prepared for what comes next. And people who were really, really successful thousands of years ago and thousands of years into the future, they will have some basic knowledge that they pull from being resourceful, but mostly they know how to learn, they know how to innovate, they know how to collaborate and self-direct and be flexible, because there's not only one pathway. And they also can do that in a way that's really productive, because, you know, it can't take you 100 years to, like, you know, to do something that a computer can do in 5 minutes. And so this is where, again, technology is not the tool, but it is a tool that will allow you to be more productive. Because as much as I have some core knowledge and skills about the writing process and about UDL, and I'm a critical thinker and I can communicate, the reality is if George and I were like, you know, handwriting in cursive letters and mailing them from Boston to Canada, you know, I don't know how quickly we would have been able to get a book out. So it's all about, you know, if we want to innovate inside the box, we have to embrace expert learning. We have to embrace the innovator's mindset. And we do that in lieu of using all these 21st century job ready, career ready, college ready. It's like, these are skills you need to be successful, period, end of story.
And I'm just thinking, my back, you know, I'm going to say something about the brain, but when I think about the human brain and the innovation that's happened throughout our own evolutionary history, it's the innovators that have gotten us to where we are today. And so it's really exciting to think that we're designing for those for the future. It's really, and we're 20 years into the first century here. It's crazy. It's 2020.
Well,
George,
I just want to add something. I think that a lot of times when we talk about, like, you know, why are we talking about 21st century skills? Like, we're 20 years into it. For me, it's like, we got 80 years to go. Like, it's awesome. Like, you really think you're going to know what's going on 70 years from now, right? Like these aren't going to be the same things. But the reason why I think, like, the book and the work and how we connect it is so powerful is if you look at the characteristics that we share, you know, talk about resiliency, empathy, these are things that are never going away. And I think, like, really the focus, I think this is what, you know, Katie and I really focus on, is that we don't know your classroom. We can give you some ideas, but at the end of the day, we want you to develop these skills in yourself, so that when you're looking at this, you might take an idea that we've shared in the book and actually remix it and think differently about it. And you're developing those skills, because, you know, there's no, like, I wish we could write the book that, you know, solves everything and just, you know, here are the things you do, and if you do them, everything work out. But the reality is, we really want to empower the people that we work with, not only in the book, but in the work that we do every single day, that it's not about giving you the solutions and copying that part of it, going back to the relationship piece. It's knowing who you work with. It's knowing the people that you serve. And I think that we've really wanted to develop these skills. And, you know, Katie has, like, alluded to this a million times tonight, that no matter who you are, and no matter what kid you're in class, you should have every opportunity to be successful. That's something that we want to do. And if we're focusing on developing those abilities within, you know, the frameworks that we have to work, the kids will be fine 300 years from now, right? But we're so focused on like stuff, not about abilities and what we're developing in our kids.
And there is a question here on, you know, I want to see examples in classrooms, which I absolutely, yes. However, there isn't going to be one way that it's going to look, but you're probably going to have a lot of questions that you'll want to ask teachers and students to be able to get at all of these different pieces. In 30 seconds, do you have a way of answering that really challenging question? What does this look like?
When people say, what does UDL look like? I always say, what does fashion look like? Because they're like, I could show you some examples of UDL, but then you're like, well, that's not my style. You know, the reality is, ask your students. Like, that's my number one thing is, you know, like, literally ask your students, ask their parents, is every day in here. Do you feel honored for who you are? Do you feel like you're doing challenging work? Do you see the relevance in what you're doing? You know, if you want to write to George and I, we can provide you with some questions. But like the reality is here is that like I could show you a number of videos. I did some work on the teaching channel and you can see what that looks like, but it always comes down to, but I don't teach that grade, or I don't have that book, or that's a little bit more, it's a little bit, you know, the personality is a little bit different. And so it might be helpful as an exemplar, but the reality is that it's going to be driven by students. And so seeing a teacher do it, there's not that much to see, because it's what did the teacher create so students can do a lot of this work themselves.
Oh, and I feel like that's where the magic and the excitement comes in. And you probably won't see everyone doing the same thing at the same time. Sometimes that might be necessary, but my guess is that might be something you start to see just a little bit. And you all are sharing really important comments in the chat box. So thank you all for continuing to think about how you're viewing this and how you're processing all of this. So let's start the movement. So I love this. I want to know more about UDL. Katie is a prolific writer and presenter and advocate for all kids. So you can visit her at www.novakeducation.com. You can follow her at Katie Novak UDL on Twitter. I have read every one of these books, and I don't know which I would recommend more. They're all fantastic and all very different and very important. So a lot of these are published through CAST Professional Publishing. CAST is the organization that founded UDL, and we're really excited to get to host this webinar with George and Katie. So George and Katie, do you have any last words for us?
Well, also on that bit.ly, we do have a website for the book that has a book study guide. Is it innovateinthebox.com, Innovate Inside the Box?
Innovateinsidethebox.com, yeah.
And then George has about 1 billion more posts than me on Twitter. He's much more interesting to follow because, as he says, I only post once every 7 weeks. So Couros is where you get a blog.
You post, in that once, it's like 84 posts, like all within
That's
like
how
a
I
24
work in
period.
all things. I'm slow and then
Yeah. I actually just want to share, because I saw one of the questions and I just want to kind of address it. And I think part of, you know, when we talk about the idea of innovation, a lot of people think about like, and this is why, you know, I talk about the idea, this is more about your mindset than it is about stuff, right? And there is a comment, something about, you know, like people feel comfortable with what they know and what's, you know, kind of like traditional. And I think really one of the things that I've talked about quite a bit is that this doesn't mean that traditional practice is bad. And one of the things I really have worked on myself is not using the term traditional practice and making it synonymous with bad practice, because I'm against bad practice, right? But like, I'll give the example. One of the things that I do that to this day is for me to get information, I tell stories. And story is actually the oldest practice probably in teaching and learning. And it's still a very good practice. And I think that's actually really important. And the one example that I saw today, I was in a school district here just outside of New York City. And they actually had a student who was struggling reading. And they simply moved the student from like a paper text to an iPad. And all of a sudden the kid is just doing awesome reading. And partly it's because of how they manipulate, you know, and it was just really interesting. And the thing is that a lot of people would say, well, that's not really using technology in a really transformative way, because you could have just read, you know, on a book, and now you're just reading on an iPad. And they'll use things like the Stammer model, and they'll say like it's just substitution, it's low level. I'm like, but the focus should always be, is it transformative to the kid? And that's what the teacher is doing, even though it was a very, like, kind of considered a traditional practice, you know, but the kid was now reading in a way they were never reading before. And it just took a little different thinking about that practice. And so I think that's something that I try to get people to think, is that you can use all the models, you can all this stuff, but the question you should be asked, is this actually beneficial to the kid? And if you start there, you're on the right path. Whether it's a new practice, old practice, whatever, if it helps the kid.
I love that you've tied it right back to that. When you see it impact a kiddo, that's where it has the real magic. So look for those moments, listen to your kids, build those relationships. Katie, do you have like 10 last words? Do you want to give you a chance to?
I mean, Check out the book. You know, it's a cool place to start because it talks about everything that people, you know, recognize is, again, what is toxic through a district that I've worked with is people thinking this is only for special education students. This benefits special education students, your linguistically and culturally diverse students, your students who experience trauma, you know, economically disadvantaged, English language learners. This meets the needs of all students. And it's painful to me to think about this in an exclusionary model where we're only going to do UDL for students who are already in a sub-separate program. The purpose of UDL is to eliminate the inequities of an inclusive general education classroom so all students can really be a part of it.
Awesome. I'm going to let you all please go take reflection time because there was a whole lot in here and your brain does need time to reflect on it. So journal, draw, go for a run, take a shower, whatever you need to do to process it. The recording will be made available. Check your emails when that comes out. We'll make sure to post it and send you all emails. And anyone who's listening to the recording later, please connect with us all on Twitter. So this conversation doesn't have to start. This is just the start of the conversation. We really want to continue to learn and work with you all. So thank you all so much for joining us, regardless of your time zone. George and Katie, it's such a privilege to get to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much. And I will be seeing you all hopefully very soon. Have a great evening, day. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Yeah, that's it. You just go, just say goodbye.
Oh my gosh,
yeah.
Katie Novak style.
Woohoo!
Okay, well, I'm going to log out. I hope you have a wonderful night. Katie, always good to